Father Andrew had told me, make a presentation, talk about what you're doing at Wyoming Catholic College, and make it practical. So here's the first practical piece of advice. Don't start a college. So one of the best things the eparchies can do is not start their own college. You'll meet people who have founded colleges in asylums and graveyards, but that's about it. But I will try to talk a little bit about what we're doing at Wyoming Catholic College, and then what are some, when possible, practical things that could apply outside of that. For those who don't know, Wyoming Catholic College is a baby college. We had our first students in 2007. Of those, we had about 36 students. 6 of them were Byzantine Catholics. Our vice president of administration was Luke Masick, also a Byzantine Catholic, and had moved up to Lander, and we hired 2 founding faculty members from the International Theological Institute in Austria who had been immersed in the East. And so by a sort of bizarre coincidence, we ended up, or we'll call providence, ended up with this richly Eastern sympathetic group in the middle of the Wild West. And at that time, we didn't yet have a chaplain. Our first chaplain ended up having biritual faculties through the Ukrainian eparchy. And so from the very first chaplain, we had a weekly Byzantine liturgy as present at Wyoming Catholic College from its starting. Shortly, just in recent memory, 6 years ago, we hired Father David Anderson as our full-time Byzantine chaplain, and remain the only Catholic college in the country, to my knowledge, that has a fully devoted chaplain just for the Eastern Rite services. There's other colleges that have Eastern Rite Catholic priests who may also say liturgy on the side, but we're the only one that has a fully implemented chaplaincy. So what I want to talk about is, in some sense, the principles that have made that make sense to us and how those can be used more broadly. Wyoming Catholic College fasts from an awful lot of technology, and so in keeping with that, we couldn't get the Bluetooth to work. So we're going to do old school as I go, and occasionally just change slides as we go forward. So let's go to the next. When we think about, we just have a number of pictures here. One of the distinctive things that Wyoming Catholic College does is our students come, they have an integrated 4-year program, which is fairly intensive. They read thousands and thousands of pages. They're studying a miniature or undergraduate version of the theology program at the International Theological Institute, a great books-based philosophy, a great books-based literature program. And they also spend 3 weeks doing an initial backpacking trip before they begin their freshman year, a week of winter camping, 6 more weeks of outdoor adventures, and a semester of horsemanship, bundled with this great books curriculum and bundled with this robust Eastern chaplaincy program. Now, initially, one might think that that's a bunch of random things to put together. But as I was reflecting on this, in fact, reflecting on it more explicitly when I went to go speak at the Cheptitsky Institute last summer for Father Andrew, when we think about the Byzantine tradition, we can note there's 3 distinctive pieces that have formed the leaders of our church since the very early church. On the one hand, there's the desert spirituality, the wilderness spirituality that we see embodied in, say, Father Anthony the Great going out in the desert fathers. So much so that, in fact, John Paul II will say one of the distinctive marks of the Eastern churches is that the desert air is still so strongly present in them. They're more overtly breathing that wilderness spirituality and making it present. It's at the root of the West, but it's now mediated more often through other subsequent devotions, whereas in the East, that sort of raw wilderness spirituality remains a fundamental basis, even when Catherine Doherty retranslates Eastern spirituality to the West. What she's going to do is talk about pustinia, the need to go out into the wilderness. So there's on that bit, the wilderness spirituality side. Then, of course, and in keeping with the theme of the assembly, our great liturgical tradition, our rootedness in our liturgical life. And then thirdly, and this is something that has maybe dropped out of awareness as often, a deep rootedness in classical education. And so when you look at the great leaders of the church, we're going to see some blend of all three of those things. So Basil the Great goes and studies in Athens, then goes and does some field study in the desert with the Desert Fathers, apprenticing in Egypt, and then comes and embodies that in the liturgy that bears his name. We'll see the same thing in John Chrysostom, that rootedness in the classical rhetorical tradition, the devotion to the Syrian monks up in the mountains, and then the making of that present in the cities in the liturgy, whether or not the liturgy that bears his name actually is his, but the same point being there. And we can go down through that and see St. Theodore the Studite's creative work, again, drawing on the classical tradition, drawing on the desert tradition, making it present in the liturgy. So here in this age of renewal, it seems to me providentially, what we're doing at Wyoming Catholic College is immersing our students in the wilderness, giving them the opportunity to draw from that classical tradition of education, and then through the robust chaplaincy program, allow them to embody that in the liturgy. But then they're only with us for 4 years, and so then we can send them out to form and lead the renewal where they go. And there's some exciting signs of this. In the last 3 years, we've had 5 crownings from our graduates. All right, and that's of only, again, tiny, but in the Byzantine church, tiny's normative. We've had less than 150 graduates in the last 3 years, and yet 5 crownings. In the chaplaincy program, we have roughly 150 communicants on every Sunday. And that's not just the students, that will be people from the community, people who are moving to Lander, hearing about this, people who are hungry for it and coming. Last year, we had 20 baptisms and chrismations. And that's not from the students. All right, so there's something clearly, there's a vitality going on. So this is why I think it's worth us looking and seeing, all right, what are ways of blending wilderness, classical education, the liturgy, that we can use as a model for what we're doing in the church beyond just tiny Lander, Wyoming. So the first thing we want to note is the challenges of today. For the most part, they're not actually whitewater rapids, though it might feel like that. But I want to talk especially about a cultural difficulty that we're facing. And that's what cultural commentator Ted Gioia calls the dopamine culture. And when he talks about the dopamine culture, he says the dopamine culture is something fueled by Silicon Valley's approach to culture. And he wants to note that when we initially think of culture, we might think of art, which is the tiny little fish over here on the side. And then we might think of, well, okay, yeah, but popularly it's entertainment. He said, but really at Silicon Valley, what they pitched us is distraction, but a distraction that leads necessarily to addiction. And the addiction comes from what he calls the dopamine hits. Short, quick, repeatable bursts that give us a hit of pleasure that drive us to repeat them over and over again. And so we get a culture that's dedicated to giving us addictive dopamine hits. So here's the way Ted Gioia describes that. He says, if you look on the left side here, well, I guess you're, whichever side here, closer to me, the slow traditional culture we can see as it applies to these things. And then over on the other side, we can talk about what that expression looks like in the dopamine culture. So on the level of athletics, traditional culture is playing a sport, or at least going and watching the live sport that's played by people you know. So in small town Lander, Wyoming, the tradition was for the old guys to play the high school kids every Sunday. And that's what baseball was for Lander, Wyoming, until it became professionalized and we got to watching a sport on cable television. And then that actually just turns out that requires way too long of an attention span. And so aside from just changing the baseball rules, we then subsequently get gambling on sports. And so now the pregame shows for baseball or football or basketball are giving you the gambling tips, not just on the game itself, but betting on what's the first pitch going to be, how many strikes are there going to be in this inning, et cetera. Because we don't have an attention span to get through the whole game, we've got to gamify the watching of the game with some kind of a gambling app. And we can go down on these other and see where every one of those, this sort of dopamine culture expression. Journalism, we go from newspapers to clickbait, video from film and TV to reels of short videos that last no more than 30 seconds long, typically have like a high chipmunk voice because they're sped up so quickly so that they're racing to speak very fast. Or you've got an AI narration that's this flat, and you watch multiple versions of this. It's a far cry away from watching great film. Music, instead of listening to great albums, we're talking about short 30-second TikToks. Images, scrolling on a phone, communication, short texts, principally written in emoji, and relationship has gone from a courtship and marriage focus to swiping on the app. All of that driven by apps on social media, and our young people, last study on this, Generation Z, so 17 to 22 is the last group they studied, spends roughly 7 hours a day recreationally on their screens. In the Anglophone world. That's recreationally on their screens. And what they're doing on those screens is the dopamine culture side. Now, if we think about that, we realize, wow, we are creating a generation that is developing habits that render them incapable of deeply entering into a long, repetitive, ritualized liturgy. If you have a liturgy that's an hour and a half to 2 hours long and you are utterly conditioned by a dopamine culture, not only are you going to be bored, you're not going to have an ability to track it. You're going to get anxious. Most of our young people today are checking their phones in the grocery store line because that's too long without distraction. They couldn't make it through the little entrance, much less the entire liturgy, without distraction. So that means we need to do something. If we're talking about evangelizing and forming, we need to do something that helps the laity, the young, form habits that allow them to enter into the liturgy, to more deeply appreciate it. Now, we do that intensively at Wyoming Catholic College. With a great slide, hit it again, which summarizes, again, so clearly not shooting for the tech, but that's the Wyoming wilderness approach here. But here's what the slide roughly says, is that there's a whole bunch of marketing out there right now for people who want to get away. In fact, the Southwest Airlines slogan a few years ago was "Want to get away," right? And buy an airplane ticket. Now the marketing involves showing you beaches or mountains or forests and inviting you to go get away from it all, turn off the phone, and have this moment to escape a world of virtual reality and languorous comfort. So people want that. And the reality is our tradition with its wilderness spirituality, the calling for the desert, also wants that, also wants to encourage that. And so what we need to offer is, in fact, some kind of wilderness retreat, some kind of pustinia. And the longer, the better. And once you're out in this wilderness retreat, these are reflections that are written somewhat by our students. We do a combination. When you're out in the wilderness, we have them doing things like rock climbing or whitewater rafting, which has an element of adventure, has an element of adrenaline, but then you're out there for long enough that it gets slow and you have time for quiet, time for reflection, time for communication. One of our students wrote this: nature puts you in your place. My muscles ached and my knuckles and ears burned with sunspots. My inexperience forced me to rely on the kindness and patience of my classmates. I felt humbled and small, and I'd never felt more real. That was a student that had come to us. She'd been living in The Hague and had moved to Wyoming to be a student. Now she's an editor in New York, and she comes out every summer for a week to remind herself of feeling more real. So the nature retreat doesn't only give us the quiet. It's a place, as the Desert Fathers attest, a place of testing, a place of measuring ourselves, a place of encountering our own failings, of being driven to rely on others, to have them wash our feet or care for us, and to confront ourselves with the Creator and His work. Again, a great, great line at the top of this, but not visible. The student writing this, all the students come out after the 3-week trip and they write an essay reflecting on their experience. And this student noted that she was on this moment, she looked over this vista and she just cried. And she just wept, and she didn't know why she was weeping. So she wrote the essay, she realized she was weeping because in that moment she intuited this beauty was in a real way made for her. And it's made for each one of us who go out there and encounter it, but a real way made for her, that God had sculpted this mountain so that she would know she was personally loved by Him. And as a result, wept in its presence. So again, the wilderness retreat, it gives us a moment of quiet, it gives us a moment of challenge, but it also gives us a moment of encountering the incredible love and grandeur of the Creator. So what do we need to do beyond that? Now, because here's the other thing we'd note. In the Desert Fathers, they don't have a romantic notion of the wilderness. They don't talk about going into the wilderness the way, Wordsworth does, and encountering the sublime and be transformed by it, and we know it's inherently good. They know that it's a fallen world and we need to bring something into that wilderness to redeem it and allow it to work on us. And for them, what they bring in is the prayer. Ted Gioia notes, Ted Gioia, who's talked about this dopamine culture, he says, well, for those of us, when we do the wilderness, that's great. What are we going to do as a community subsequent to the wilderness retreat? He says what we need is ritual. Ritual, he sees, is the fundamental response to this dopamine culture because ritual can't be downloaded or uploaded. It's sources of joy and stability in everyday life. Instead of the ceaseless quest for novelty embedded in scrolling, ritual offers the deepened satisfaction of mindful repetition. The most powerful sources of happiness in our life will actually be the result of repetition in family or vocational relationships. Ritual is how we cultivate this deepened type of repetition. All right. So again, when we do with our students, we bring them out into the wilderness, but we also then dispose them to rituals. But the rituals start more broadly than just the sacred ritual of the liturgy. We have rituals of the community that surround it on particular days that are particularly engaging that help them with this. Skip this one for a moment. Skip that one, yeah, sorry. Okay, and again. And then that's what we do in the chaplaincy program. In these rituals, we give them this way of forming habits of doing things together. So what's that look like? On the one hand, most of our students walk to church every Sunday. They don't drive. And a few of them make it an actual procession. They go down, they walk, and they sing as they walk down Main Street to get to church. Right? On certain key feast days, we'll do processions. We will, as we'll show later in the slides, on Theophany, we have the Romanian tradition of baptizing the horses. You go out and bless the horses with the Jordan water. And so we have a large herd of horses, and so we'll go out and we'll do this and then have some riding contests like they do in the Romanian villages. Why? Because those rituals create habits of community, shared experience that then rhyme with the deeper, longer ritual of the divine liturgy. All right. So our chaplaincy program then is devoted to embedding ritual and uniting the experience of ritual, the experience of reflection with the experience of wilderness. So this is a picture of Mother Natalia out in the desert of Moab, who went and led our students on a week-long Pustinia retreat. She went out in the spring. They actually showed up. They left on the Sunday of Mary of Egypt. So we had a liturgy for Mary of Egypt, gave all the students 3 loaves of bread, so that's all you get. We packed more, but gave them a little bit of panic. And then sent them out for the week so they could have their Mary of Egypt experience. And they went out and had these rituals of praying the hours through the day, meditations from Mother Natalia. And then a number of them actually did just eat bread and water for the week, which was not the goal, but they really got into it as they went there. Or we send priests like Father Michael Lee out on the 3-week backpacking trip. So this is Father Mike Lee's setup for celebrating the divine liturgy in the mountains, or at least one of the setups he has used. Father, how many trips have you been on at this point?
What's that?
How many trips have you been on at this point? 5. So Father Michael Lee has spent 10 weeks over the last few years celebrating the divine liturgy in the mountains of Wyoming for the students. He goes in, and then after 2 weeks, we send him out on horseback so the students have their week of independent travel. Okay, Father, great. And we don't have liturgy daily out there in the mountains, right? It's not a daily event, but there's some kind of daily ritual prayer. And then definitely on Sundays or on feast days for the Transfiguration, for example, make sure to have the divine liturgy on a mountaintop. Transfiguration is always out there at that point. Okay. We also do things like the students commissioned for us an icon. This is the icon of the patron of the college, Our Lady Seat of Wisdom. There she is set in front of the Teton Mountains of Wyoming with the state flower of the Indian paintbrush in front of her. And around it in Latin is the text that is common to both the East and the West for the feast of the meeting of Simeon. It's one of those texts that's used in both the Latin and the East. And so we have this feast day, in fact, associated with February 2nd. And this is one of the other points I want to make about as we're talking about things we can do practically. Finding places to have joint ritual with the Romans, not as a kind of syncretizing of the rite or a Latinization or a Hellenization, but moments of celebrating together forms stronger community, allows us to have a larger group that takes part in this. So this is one of the ones that we have. So we have our icon of Our Lady Seat of Wisdom. We have our respective liturgies on February 2nd. February 2nd, we have the cancel class, have a huge blessing of the candles in the procession for the Byzantine liturgy, smaller version of that for the Roman liturgy. And then on the evening of February 3rd, we chant the Akathist to Our Lady Seat of Wisdom, which is composed just by people at the college. And it's an interesting blend of echoes of the great Akathist and echoes of the Litany of Loretto. And has, again, it's not a liturgical event, and you're able to express this Marian devotion all together with ends up being a monthly occasion outside of the liturgy with candle procession, the veneration of the icon, to then prepare for the celebration in the respective rituals and rites. Tends to be much shorter than a long, prolonged liturgy, so again, a way of instantiating the ritual in the community life in a way that touches on it and prepares them and disposes them for liturgy. We are blessed, as I said, with Father David Anderson. Father David is a particular note in this regard. Father David was the way he will put it, the prized student of Father Alexander Schmemann at St. Vladimir Seminary, and took copious notes. And after Father Schmemann's death, Father David was sent out to California to try to instantiate Father Schmemann's vision of the liturgy for at that time, the experiment with the evangelical Protestants that were converting to Orthodoxy and create a instantiation of this. They didn't go completely smoothly, and Father David ended up being received into the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, was in Ukiah for a number of years right outside of Mount Tabor Monastery, and then came to Wyoming Catholic College in 2019. Now, I was really hoping I could announce that we'd finalized what we're trying to do with the chaplaincy at Wyoming Catholic College, but Father Joel Barstead, who's the pastor in Denver, whose territory extends all the way to Lander, is on a pilgrimage to Japan, and so we weren't able to get this finalized. But the goal is to make, in 2003, Denver established St. Cyril and Methodius Russian Catholic outreach. And then that was taken over by the eparchy to oversee it in 2022, I believe. It's the Eparchy of Phoenix oversees it. And the goal is to make that formal expression of the St. Cyril and Methodius outreach at Wyoming Catholic College, which would let us sort of systematically go over all of the notes and the various creative and traditional things that Father David does and systematize them in a way, propose them to Bishop Artur, and be able to have a sort of formal reception of the Shmeiman tradition within the Russian Greek Catholic tradition overseen by the Eparchy of Phoenix. So that's the project we're working on. The details are not yet finalized. But that's the direction we're moving toward. Which the advantage of that both allows us to normalize the experience of the liturgy for the students and streamline them returning in terms of their connection to the Ruthenian eparchy as we go forward. One of the other things that I want to note that we've had Bishop Robert, we've got a lot of you that have come to visit. If you haven't visited yet, feel free to come by. We had Bishop Robert as our commencement speaker in 2024. And this is the chapel that we have at Wyoming Catholic College for the Byzantine chaplaincy. When I was in Vancouver, Bishop Ken Novakoski at that time was the Ukrainian bishop for New Westminster. He's now in London. And he had mentioned at that point that one of the things that struck him when he visited Europe was that the churches were built in the piazza, in the square, in the center of life. And in America, most of our churches are in suburbs. They might have been built in the center of life at some point, but life subsequently moved, or they're still in the center, but the people's life doesn't revolve around that. They've now moved to some other location. And he said he felt that if we're going to figure out ways of embodying ritual again in the tradition of the church, maybe we need to think about creative placement of the churches. So I'd like to say that we did this really deliberately and with careful planning, but really it's just the space we had available. This chapel is right on Main Street. You walk down the main street of the town, it looks like a storefront. You step in through the glass doors, and then all of a sudden there's an iconostasis and rugs, and it's filled up. And so when we have our regular chaplaincy schedule, and it's a full chaplaincy schedule, there's Vespers every day at 5. Every time there's Divine Liturgy, there's Vespers, Matins, and the liturgy itself. Liturgy every Saturday morning, great Vespers every Saturday night, great Matins, and then Sunday liturgy on Sunday. So you end up with people walking by, and they hear the music coming out. There's a bank right next door to us, and you walk into the bank, and it smells like incense. They have not complained. I think it's a win for them, too. And so here, embedded in just the flow of downtown life, we've got the liturgy. Now, I don't know if we'd want to do that if we didn't have the wilderness retreat and the cell phone fast accompanying the experience. But because the students have the experience of being out in the wilderness, of fasting from their phones, then coming down in the daily life and having liturgy as this moment of gathering, of synaxis, is this moment of celebration and gathering together. They've disposed themselves with quiet and study, and they come together and they celebrate right there on Main Street. Again, I don't know if I can recommend this as like, oh yes, this is what every parish should do. It probably not. We have lots of advantages. Everyone can walk to the chapel. It's a walking distance. The furthest away one of our parishioners lives, it's a 10-minute drive. So people come in to the daily services. Whereas in Denver, for example, people are driving 30, 45 minutes to get to the parish. Having such a regular flow of services embedded in the middle of the walk probably doesn't work in the practical reality. But this is disposing students with that experience who will then return to our parishes, have that lived thought, and be thinking, how can they be leaders in our parishes in creative ways, having embodied the ritual with the wilderness fast and the careful reflection on the theology as they've gone. Next slide. And here we just have the Lenten experience for our pre-sanctified liturgy. And the students sing. The setting they sing for Let My Prayer Rise Like Incense is the setting that was popular in Russia at the time that Dostoevsky's referencing it in Brothers Karamazov. So they're singing chants that are referenced in the books that they're reading while themselves experiencing the ritual in the course of their studies and embodying it in their daily life. All right. And then here's just some other creative ways we've done it. We have, when we do our wilderness altars out in the snow camping, we put the antimints and build a snow altar, have the antimints out there. There's the blessing of the horses, the theophany where we go up to Sinks Canyon. The water sinks down and disappears in the canyon and then comes up later and it fills up, it provides all of the water for the town. And so we go up to that place where it sinks and we bless the water there on Theophany. Everyone dunks their head in the frozen lake. The students sometimes actually just jump in because they're 18-year-olds, submerge themselves in that. And then they go out after that for a week of winter camping, having blessed the snow and blessed the water, blessed the horses, and go out. Again, these embodied rituals that dispose them to rejoice in the deeper, slower course of the divine liturgy. Here, I think, is the fundamental point we want to make. And this is why we don't just provide this great experience to our students. We have started an outreach where we take about 1,000 people a year out on wilderness retreats into the backcountry. Currently, we have 4 Latin Rite seminaries that go out for 3 weeks and do the 3-week backpacking trip with us for the part of the propedeutic year. We take the CFRs, all the postulates for the Franciscan friars, the Renewal, out and do this. We take high schools, we take father-son groups, mother-daughter groups, and we do that, and we take them out, we try to get a chaplain out with them. So far, we have not yet been able to have a full Byzantine outreach week, but I'd love to be able to get there. Love to eventually be able to be taking our seminarians out or our deacons out. And the quote we give to everyone when they come is the quote from St. John Chrysostom. Seek out those who dwell in the desert. Take a long journey to visit the mountains and see the wilderness. Stay for a day or two. For when you give money to those who dwell there, you will also give your soul, becoming estranged from the world. St. John was telling this, preaching in the church of Antioch, telling his people, what do you need to do? Go take a retreat to the mountains and then come back and worship with us. Go study with the monks. Go then form your mind with the preaching of the classically trained priests and come worship with us. Whatever else we're doing at Wyoming Catholic College, I think the more we can encourage the faithful to come out into the mountains, break away from their phones, take a pause, have a moment of renewal, deepen the preaching and the reflection in this great classical theological tradition that is ours, and regather to worship. It is going to reinvigorate our churches. It's reinvigorating the young people we have, and we want to work with you to get these young people into places where they can influence and further share their gifts in our parishes. Thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit more? You mentioned at the end of your presentation about the opportunities for those who are not college students to come out into the wilderness. Can you tell us what opportunities would be available to, say, priests?
Sure. So, well, we have several things going on. I'll talk about two key outreaches that are available. One is we partner with another organization, and this is to dispose to this and then to help subsequently, which is based in Lander, Wyoming, Humanality, which is focused on helping families, parishes, et cetera, make intensive, deliberate plans for fasting or regulating their cell phone use or screen use. For the wilderness, so I think that's an important front country aspect of it. And so if you want to be connected with Humanality and work on various options, they're happy to have that happen, to get a sort of Pustinia, the marketplace experience, a fast from the phone when you can. What do we do in terms of these other outdoor trips? So it's through our department. It's called Core Expeditions, Catholic Outdoor Renewal, Core Expeditions. And there's two things. One, we're always looking for chaplains. So if you want to come serve as a chaplain on a week-long backpacking trip, rafting trip, rock climbing trip, let me know. And then we'll place you with a group that is open to having a Byzantine chaplain. And Father Mike has all the notes that you need for how you actually celebrate Divine Liturgy out there while you're doing that, and we'd love to get you out there, or come out with our students, any of those options. Other trips, we have open enrollment trips where people can just sign up and come do a backpacking trip, or go out to our property in Moab and do a desert backpacking trip, various other options there. Or you can get a group that books a trip, whether it's a high school or a college group or a parish father-son group, eventually maybe the seminary, whatever the case may be there.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I've heard a lot about Wyoming Catholic College, so it was great to hear it from you and to hear a lot of the inspiration and the kind of theological background for what you do in a concrete way. I was curious about what you mentioned about having some kind of liturgical tradition approved. Of course, I definitely want to ask you more about that during the breaks, but is this kind of going in the direction of something like an American Byzantine Catholic?
No. So I don't have any highfalutin goals there in that regard. Yeah, no. I think we have the Ruthenian tradition that we have approved, et cetera. What currently happens for the Russian Catholics is just each priest is, a law unto himself and does something roughly within the tradition, which is also what Father David does beautifully and extravagantly. But there's certainly from my perspective as a president of an institution, I'd like to get some more clear canonical guardrails on what that is and have some clear way of that going forward, right? So is it just Father David's liturgy, or is this actually a tradition? Is this Father Schmeman's liturgy or no, it's the tradition of the church. What's that look like? And then being able to allow other chaplains, which we hope after Father David, to come in and celebrate in some continuity, but then have that liturgy in clear relationship to the other expressions of the Ukrainian, Greek Catholic, the Ruthenian, et cetera, as we go. But love to talk more about the details of that, yeah.
Do you have any association with Duchovny Dom outside of Western Oak?
We don't have any formal association, no. Love to, yes.
I think it would be a good match.
That'd be great.
I have a question. I was just reflecting on. I'm going to talk. This is really Bob. I was just reflecting on the last talk, and David spoke so beautifully about wanting to cultivate excellent media products to be able to not only disseminate ad extra, but also catechize us ad intra. And there's a way in which that kind of works a little bit at cross purposes of what you're talking about, because it kind of feeds into this dopamine addiction. I don't think it's necessarily totally incompatible, because one of the things that we hear David saying is that at the heart of it is not just excellent quality, but really fine content. So, could you reflect a little bit about how we might be able to bridge the gap between your two talks so that they're not two different blood types? Yeah.
Right. So what we tell the students is what we're not saying is the new social media or the new cell phone or whatever, the new at this point, 18-year-old cell phone, whatever the case is, are intrinsically evil devices and you can't ever use them. What we stress to them is that the reality is with any technological advance, it both expands our reach but also has an internal effect on us and affects the habits of the community. And when the technological advances, especially in things related to communicative technology, relationships, etc., start accelerating so very, very quickly, there's a way in which there's no pause to reflect on how a community or a person absorbs that or what habits they need to have properly dispose them to that. And so then what dictates the habits is a profit-centered desire to make people addicted and spend more time on their screens, as opposed to the community or the person being able to set norms that allow them to use the advantages of the technology in a way that really does gain the advantages of reach and evangelization, for example, that we'd be concerned with. So on that side, what we say is the fast is to enable a re-engagement. So and we call it a technology fast deliberately because the plan is that you re-engage. Just like you fast from food, we're not saying you never eat food. You fast from food to develop the right habits in relation to food. So we have, for example, partnered with Hallow, and I was thinking Hallow seems like a great opportunity for us as a platform to use as an Eastern Catholic Church. Hallow is deliberately, as a prayer app, designing things to be non-addictive, but to make the wealth of the spiritual tradition of the churches more accessible to someone who happens to be online. But in order to design a non-addictive app that really is evangelical, but also is just allowing for human flourishing, you need to yourself not be addicted to a dopamine cycle of the use of the technology. If you are addicted in a dopamine cycle of the use of technology, whatever you're going to create is going to lean into those addictive models of behavior. And that doesn't mean we don't want to have flashy things that attract attention, that are quality setup, as David said. But it does mean that we want something that is actually not going to be, we don't want to get people so excited about the new liturgy app that we have that they're going to be scrolling on the liturgy app all the time and not go to liturgy, because that doesn't allow for their attention, because the flashcards that we have on the app are so much more exciting than what actually happens at Father's Parish. So that, I think, is what we need. We need to have a cultivation of an internal and ideally communal habits around technology to allow us to use it in its most successful evangelical outreach.
You mentioned the Schmemann tradition. Could you flesh that out just a little bit?
So Father Alexander Schmemann at the St. Vladimir Seminary really wrote a number of things that revitalized the way of seeing the Eastern liturgical tradition. And in that time, he and the people working with him had a very deep respect for the tradition, but also a kind of, as is common for the time, a kind of creative cutting and pasting approach that occasionally expressed itself as well. And so, as was sort of bound up with that period of liturgical reform in the West, the sort of sense that this thing needs to be fixed, not just recovered. And there's a delicate balance there. So you end up with a number of people within that tradition doing things that are following ideas or experiments or fixings, but they haven't been sort of formally received. And so you end up with some things I think are really beautiful. I'm not in a position to myself judge them, but what my thought is that if we have that embodied in our outreach at Wyoming Catholic College, what I'd love to do is put that into communication and conversation with the churches and the Episcopal oversight.